Could Homo sapiens actually be better explained as a southern branch of Neanderthals? A new wave of genetic modelling has begun to destabilise what once appeared to be one of the most secure narratives in paleoanthropology, the long-standing picture of Homo sapiens emerging cleanly in Africa and later encountering Neanderthals as a separate Eurasian species is no longer able to comfortably accommodate the full range of genetic, morphological and archaeological evidence. A new model proposed by David Reich, which we explained in a recent video, represents one of the most serious attempts to resolve these contradictions, and its implications are already profound. Reich's model essentially says that Neanderthals can be explained as a branch of Homo sapiens that split off around 250,000 years ago, migrated into Western Europe, and interbred with a highly diverged, archaic human likely represented by the Sema or Arago specimens. Yet, even that model, for all its explanatory power, may not go far enough. It still preserves a directional assumption that Homo sapiens came first and Neanderthals were derived through admixture that can itself be inverted. When that inversion is explored carefully, a more coherent and parsimonious model emerges, one in which Homo sapiens are best understood not as the originators of Neanderthals, but as a southern, warm-adapted branch of a broader Neanderthal-grade population. Reich's model begins with a genuine and unresolved problem in genetics. When researchers compare Neanderthal and modern human genomes, they encounter a mismatch that is difficult to reconcile under traditional assumptions. The bulk of the nuclear genome suggests deep divergence, hundreds of thousands of years of largely separate evolution. Yet the uniparental markers, mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, tell a completely different story. These lineages appear to have been replaced in Neanderthals by versions closely related to those found in modern humans roughly 300,000 years ago. This is not a trivial anomaly. The probability that both mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA would be replaced through minor incidental admixture is extremely low. It implies something large-scale and directional, not occasional contact. To resolve this, Reich proposes a scenario in which an early Homo sapiens population expands out of Africa or the Levant into Eurasia and undergoes massive introgression with local archaic populations. Through repeated interbreeding at the expansion frontier, the incoming population becomes genetically transformed, absorbing the majority of its genome from the archaic inhabitants, while retaining key lineages such as mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA. In this way, Neanderthals could be the result of a sapiens-derived expansion that became heavily archaic in its genetic composition. This is an elegant solution to the genetic paradox. It explains the replacement of uniparental markers while preserving the predominantly Neanderthal character of the nuclear genome. It also accounts for shared technological traditions such as Levallois stone tool production and Mousterian industries, suggesting these were carried by expanding populations rather than independently invented. The model even accommodates the increasingly recognized complexity of human evolution as a braided network of populations rather than a simple branching tree. But there is an unexamined assumption embedded in this framework, that the expanding population must be labeled Homo sapiens, and that Neanderthals are therefore the derived condition. This assumption is not demanded by the data. It is inherited from the traditional narrative. If we strip that assumption away and focus purely on the evidence, an alternative interpretation becomes not only possible, but arguably more consistent. Consider the genetic evidence first. The key observation is that Neanderthals share mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages with modern humans, introduced around 300,000 years ago. Reich interprets this as sapiens genes entering Neanderthals. But the reverse interpretation is equally viable, that these lineages were already present in a widespread structured population that included what we later call Neanderthals, and that the populations we label Homo sapiens simply retained or amplified these lineages in certain regions. In other words, instead of sapiens introducing these markers into Neanderthals, both groups may have inherited them from a shared population that had not yet been cleanly divided into separate species. This reinterpretation aligns more naturally with the archaeological record. The technological continuity between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens is too deep to be explained as mere diffusion or convergence. Mousterian industries, Levallois reduction strategies, hafting techniques, and controlled use of fire appear across both groups in overlapping timeframes and regions. These are not superficial similarities. They represent a shared cognitive and cultural system. If one population had replaced the other, or if they had evolved independently, we would expect sharper discontinuities. Instead, we see continuity. Burial practices reinforce this picture. Sites associated with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens show intentional burial, sometimes with similar body positioning and use of pigments such as red ochre. These behaviors suggest shared symbolic frameworks. They are difficult to reconcile with a model that treats the two groups as fundamentally separate species with distinct cognitive capacities. They make far more sense in a model where both are regional expressions of a single interconnected population. The morphological evidence is equally revealing. The supposed boundary between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens dissolves under close examination. Fossils such as Sacopastori in Europe, School and Kafsa in the Levant, and even specimens like Amud and Tabun exhibit mosaics of traits that defy simple classification. Some are labelled Neanderthal based on certain features, others Sapiens, yet they cluster closely when analysed without preconceived categories. Rather than forming two distinct groups, they form a gradient. This gradient suggests population structure, not species separation. It indicates that what we are seeing is variation within a broad human lineage distributed across different ecological zones. In colder northern environments, this lineage expresses the robust features associated with Neanderthals: thick bones, large nasal cavities, and stocky builds adapted to glacial conditions. In warmer southern environments, the same lineage expresses more gracile features: reduced brow ridges, narrower faces, and lighter skeletal builds. These are not markers of different species, but of adaptation. Once this is recognized, the directionality of Reich's model becomes questionable. Why assume that Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia and became Neanderthals rather than the reverse? That a Neanderthal-grade population expanded southward and gave rise to what we call Homo sapiens? The latter scenario has several advantages. First, it removes the need to explain the absence of early Homo sapiens DNA, older than 50,000 years in many regions. If sapiens are simply a regional expression of a broader population, then the lack of distinct early sapiens genomes is not surprising. We are not missing evidence of a separate species. We are looking at a continuum where distinctions are imposed retrospectively. Second, it aligns with the fossil record, which shows widespread Neanderthal-like populations across Eurasia well before 300,000 years ago. These populations are often treated as precursors or relatives, but they could equally be understood as part of a continuous lineage, from which both Neanderthals and sapiens emerge as regional variants. Third, it simplifies the genetic picture. Instead of requiring a large-scale expansion of sapiens into Neanderthal territory followed by massive introgression, we can model the process as internal differentiation within a structured population. Gene flow, local adaptation, and regional expansions would naturally produce the observed patterns without invoking a single directional event. In this revised model, the Middle Pleistocene becomes a period of dynamic population movement and ecological expansion. A widespread Neanderthal-grade population occupies large parts of Eurasia and adjacent regions. Around 300,000 years ago, subsets of this population expand into Africa and southern Eurasia, encountering different climates and resources. In these environments, selective pressures favor changes in body form, behavior, and perhaps social organization. Over time, these southern populations develop the traits we associate with Homo sapiens. Crucially, they do not cease to be part of the broader population. Gene flow continues across regions. Technologies and cultural practices are shared. The boundaries remain porous. What emerges is not a clean split, but a network of populations with varying degrees of differentiation. In fact, Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens share the same light skin genes, dating back to around 300,000 years. This model also reframes the concept of modernity. The traits often used to define Homo sapiens, symbolic behavior, complex tools, burial practices, are not unique innovations of a single species. They are expressions of capacities that were already present within the broader population and were elaborated differently in different regions. Neanderthals, in this view, are not cognitively inferior or fundamentally different. They are simply adapted to different conditions. Reich's simulations of population expansion and introgression still play a crucial role in this revised framework. They demonstrate how expanding populations can absorb local genetic material while retaining key lineages. But instead of applying this mechanism to a sapiens expansion into Neanderthals, we can apply it to multiple expansions within a single structured population. Different regions would experience different degrees of introgression and transformation, producing the diversity we observe in both fossils and genomes. The result is a model that is both simpler and more consistent with the evidence. It does not require a single origin for Homo sapiens in a specific location, followed by replacement of other populations. It does not require Neanderthals to be derived from sapiens or vice versa. Instead, it treats both as outcomes of a long, complex process of population differentiation and interaction. Perhaps most importantly, this model dissolves the rigid boundary between us and them. The distinction between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens becomes a matter of perspective rather than a fundamental biological divide. We are not looking at two separate species that briefly interbred. We are looking at different expressions of the same lineage, shaped by geography, climate, and time. In this sense, Homo sapiens can be understood as southern Neanderthals, populations that adapted to warmer environments and developed certain morphological and cultural traits, while remaining part of a broader, interconnected human system. This is not merely a provocative rephrasing, it is a logical extension of the evidence when freed from inherited assumptions. The implications are far-reaching. The out-of-Africa model in its simplest form becomes untenable. Human evolution is no longer a story of origin and replacement, but of expansion, interaction, and transformation. The tree becomes a braided river. Species boundaries become gradients, and the deep history of our lineage becomes more complex, but also more coherent. Reich's model opened the door by showing that the genetic data cannot be explained by simple divergence and limited admixture. The next step is to walk through that door and reconsider the direction of the process itself. When we do, we find that the simplest explanation may be the one that was previously unthinkable, that Neanderthals were not a side branch of Homo sapiens, but part of the central trunk, and that Homo sapiens are, in essence, their southern continuation. Thanks for watching.